Hi, Patrick. Thank you so much for coming along today. Patrick is a PhD and he's also an Alexander Technique practitioner. So we're going to be learning all about Patrick's thoughts on the Alexander Technique today. And I think that we're going to find some very rich pickings here today. Now, Patrick, first of all, tell me, you are a PhD. I'm always very impressed with people that do PhDs because I haven't got one. I've never done one. And I am impressed with the clarity in the thinking that comes from that process. And I've sort of had some friends and live with people that have had PhDs. And, you know, there is a lot of work to be done, isn't there? What did you actually study?
So I'm a PhD in physics, and I studied, my PhD was on liquid crystals, the optics of liquid crystals, which is the stuff that you're probably looking at in your video display.
Ah, so very
but there's a whole field of phase transitions and how these things, anyway, I won't go into it because it has nothing to do with Alexander Technique.
Oh, it actually wasn't anything to do with the Alexander Technique?
No. So my background's in physics. I was a practicing research physicist for about 15 years, actually, even after I got trained in Alexander Technique.
Wow.
And so basically I gradually moved away from the world of academic physics, and now I run a studio with my wife. And I do all Alexander.
I mean, that's very impressive. I mean, to have a physics background and to do all that academia and get into that, because that's obviously a very sort of rich mindset in itself. So, of course, that begs the question, how did you get into the Alexander Technique?
Right. So basically in about 2001, 2002, I had my worst back attack ever. I had been getting back attacks since about 1994 when I was teaching high school, actually. And I was also involved in dance. I'm still involved in improvisational dance.
Yeah.
And it was around then that I thought maybe this has to do with my posture. And I didn't know anything about what that meant. I just had a feeling about it. And through connections with dance, I was hooked up with an Alexander Technique teacher here in Amsterdam, Tom Koch. Yeah. And from the first lesson, like many people who teach, I was sort of blown away. I had no idea what was going on.
How long ago was that?
That was 2001 or 2002.
2001, yeah. So 20 or so years ago.
Yeah.
So you've sort of fairly experienced at the Alexander Technique now, then.
Yeah. So I ended up training from 2006 to 2010. And then I've been teaching full time since then.
Where did you train? Because I know you're from Holland. Where are you from in Holland, actually? Because
I'm not from Holland. I am from Massachusetts in the States. So I'm American. I moved to Holland to do physics research.
Oh.
I sort of went back and forth a little bit, and I ended up training with Paul Versteeg and Tessa Marwick here in Amsterdam.
Oh, great. Okay. So you actually trained in Amsterdam. It's a very nice place to train.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. And when I was training, I was also doing research. So I would train in the morning, and then I would get on my bike, stop off in the center of Amsterdam, get a bite to eat, and then head off to the lab and do science research. So it was kind of special time.
Those really special. I mean, training is special anyway, isn't it? And
right. About that.
I mean, you enjoyed the training. You thought it was a good standard, and you'd recommend your school.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, it's great. They're both Carrington trained, and it's kind of an institution here. Their school in Amsterdam.
Oh, that's great. Okay, and so well, let me just see if I think we're going to go on to the main topic now, which is, of course, we have been discussing rather vaguely, but somewhat, this whole business of the language of Alexander Technique, haven't we? Now, before we go on to that, I mean, you come from a scientific background. I'm really interested in you've been talking a lot about, you know, how we're going to kind of sort of have a more scientific overview of the Alexander Technique. Can you tell me a bit about that? Because that's really interesting. And of course, particularly with your academic background.
Right. So again, just to give a bit of history, about 2005 or so, I was a full-time associate professor, actually, of physics.
Yeah.
And I was getting just deeply into Alexander Technique, and I was looking for someone who was trying to explain it in scientific terms.
Yeah.
And I met a woman named Molly Johnson, who at that time was getting her PhD in movement science at the University of Massachusetts.
Wow.
She now runs a school in Austin, Texas, Alexander School.
Nice.
And so I talked to her quite a lot, and she also hooked me up with this guy named Npchapman, who many people will know.
Yeah.
Is a neuroscientist, movement scientist who trained in Alexander technique and did 2.5 decades of work just trying to understand the Alexander technique.
Yeah. Right.
And so basically that started like a 10-year back and forth. He's a super open guy, super patient and friendly. And he started to help me understand like a neuroscientist perspective on Alexander technique.
Very good.
Then, sorry for all the history, but 2015, I presented some of his work at one of the congresses because he couldn't get there. And that sort of started a process of us working together to give workshops about the science of Alexander technique. So that explains sort of how I got from physics to Alexander to the science of Alexander.
Well, everything's interlinked in the end, isn't it? So
it's all
nothing's quite separated completely.
Yeah. So great. I forgot your original question. It was about language.
Tell us more. Tell us more. You've got us hooked. This is really interesting. Let's talk about some of the first principles of what you're exploring and perhaps a little bit about what that talk was about.
Sure. I mean, Tim's field of research is, you should get Tim on here, is muscle tone.
Right.
And the relationship between muscle tone, posture, and movement. And he ended up working with really one of the top posture tone researchers of all time, a guy named Victor Gerfinkel in the States. And so that forms a kind of basis framework for the stuff I presented back in 2015. And that then formed like a starting point, a framework, a foundation for this whole series of workshops that we now do, where we start pulling in addition to the neuroscience and the muscle tone, posture, movement stuff, we pull in ideas from psychology about inhibition and attention and awareness, ideas from, again, neuroscience, movement science, about body schema, body awareness.
So I mean,
biomechanics, all that stuff.
By the sounds of it, what you've done is you've sort of moved slightly away from a kind of pure Alexander technique, and you've kind of got some other sort of influence, a bit like NLP, where everything's thrown into a bucket and the best things are pulled out, and there's a whole workshop idea going on. Is it a bit like that, do you think, or?
I'm not sure why you say moving away from Alexander technique. Can you explain?
Well, maybe not moving away from Alexander technique, but I mean, obviously, some of us we only do the Alexander technique and we teach it in a very practical way. We're not really going off into other areas. I wouldn't, I do look at sort of lots of different subjects, and I'm quite fascinated with quite a lot of different subjects. When I teach Alexander technique, I'm pretty much teaching that, and I'm teaching based really on my training, which was obviously Carrington School. What it sounds like you're doing there is you're saying, which is quite interesting, is you're bringing in some other aspects, some other modalities, and maybe mixing it up a bit. I mean, that's nothing to criticize. I mean, I think that's really interesting. It's just not what I do. But
right. So that's not what I do.
Right.
To clarify, so I'm an Alexander teacher. If a student comes in, I use my training in Alexander technique.
Right.
To help them with their problems and teach them what I think of as Alexander technique. And I actually, at that moment, unless it comes up, I try to throw out the science in a certain sense and rely on my ever evolving understanding and training of what I'm doing. The nice thing is that if questions come up, what's going on here? Like, how is this working? What did I just feel? What was that? Then I can offer some explanations that really clarify what's going on.
Okay, well, give us an example. Let's say I'm in a lesson and I suddenly feel very free. And I think, well, look, that muscle was really tense in my right shoulder there. And now I don't know, it just feels free, but weirdly, it doesn't really feel like my shoulder anymore. Can you explain
Nice.
that?
Love it. Okay, here's what I like about that, and I love student descriptions, is that you described a bunch of sensations and experiences.
Yeah.
So there was no jargon in there. There was no, oh, how'd you get my primary control working?
Sure.
It was just pure student experiences, right?
Yeah.
And that's how I like it. That's where I can start to offer some ideas. Okay, so they're talking about the shoulder feeling free, and I mean, from the start of lessons, I do talk about the fact that the way your shoulder is held, the way the way the tension fixates in your shoulder creates a sensation of stiffness. It creates actual stiffness in the movement, and it also creates stiffness, a sensation of stiffness.
Yeah.
And so when that pattern changes, not surprising that it feels more free. Now, why does it feel like it's not my shoulder? Well, that gets into more subtle speculation about how do we, psychologically speaking, map out our body.
Right.
And we have these internal maps that tell us what is where. Yeah. And we also have lots of processes in our brain that try to predict what's going to happen next. And if they predict correctly, then things feel normal. Yeah. And so when those internal maps are confused by a new, mechanical experience of the arm, then it might not feel quite like your arm.
Yeah. So this is maybe bringing in a neurological interpretation of what's happening there. Is that
exactly?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. If that's what they want, I'm not sitting there going, like, I have to explain it. And that the explanation I just gave to you is quite a step up from what I would do in a lesson. Right. I would only give that if they were really probing me, then I would do that.
I mean, I think, that's fine. I mean, of course, we all know that most people, when they come, they're coming very much as the lay person, and in fact, I'd go as far as to say this particular talk that I'm having with you today may not be suitable for the lay person. We're trying to understand more about the way that you're using science to interpret the Alexander technique, which I think is very interesting. But also we're going to go on to talk about the vernacular that we use in teaching the Alexander technique. So perhaps I would recommend that as this conversation goes on, it's going to be very difficult for anybody that hasn't had at least 30 lessons to understand what we're talking about or to find it interesting. So perhaps this is going to be for our students, the long-termers, and perhaps trainee teachers and some teachers like us, So what I'm interested in is of course the Alexander technique itself is a kind of it's a very practical technique. You had back pain, you don't have back pain now, you found it very useful. We all know that. What's interesting, I think, is when we try to take the Alexander technique and analyze it in a different way, or we try to bring in other modalities and or find out where it relates to other modalities, that's what I'm trying to sort of explore today. So, I mean, let's forget about the lay person in a way, because we are really two very experienced Alexander teachers, and we can really, I think, talk, although briefly, a bit more in depth about some of your sort of academic approaches to understanding the technique, which I think is very interesting. So let's open up about that. I mean, let's sort of, for example, this chap Tim, you're talking about he's into this specialist observation of movement. You've mentioned a sort of neurological sort of interpretation of what we're experiencing there. I mean, tell me a bit more about the actual science around some of the things you've studied in terms of movement and Alexander technique and so
on. Yeah, I don't know where to start, actually.
Well, it's a big subject.
It's a big topic, and I don't think, the way we like to describe the workshop is as presenting a framework. Right. So we give ideas that work together to build a kind of catalog of ideas, structured, with which you can understand what's going on. Yeah. So I suppose I mean, I liked your question about, the shoulder, because it was very specific.
Yeah.
When it comes to these general questions, I hesitate, just because it would be easier if you gave me some phenomenon from Alexander technique, that you notice from teaching or from lessons, and then I can give you a taste of how we might go about talking about it.
Well, I see. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not, yeah, I wanted to move on to that in a second. I mean, what I wanted you to sort of talk about was really some of your research. That's what I'm trying to get out of you. That, well, we did this experiment, or
I see.
and you're doing some stuff with some other guys.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so to be very clear, Tim is the one who's done the bulk of the research.
Right.
So, and basically he's done a couple of studies. I'll summarize them briefly here, and then really you should get Tim on, or have a look at our website.
Yeah.
I mean, what he did in a nutshell was he looked at sit to stand very carefully.
He looked at sit to stand.
Moving from sit to stand.
Yeah.
And he varied the speed at which people moved from sitting to standing.
Right.
And so as he slowed that down, he continued to ask people to perform the movement smoothly. And he had two groups. One were Alexander teachers, and one were just non-trained people.
Yeah, everyday people. Yeah.
And sure enough, at the Alexander technique teachers, as you slow down the movement, could continue to move very smoothly through each position. Right? And the non-trained people would hit a point where they would get kind of stuck.
Yeah.
And then they would have to lurch forward.
Yeah, well, we all know
so that's what I mean about a specific experience from lessons, because we're all familiar with that, whether we're students or teachers, that moment, that critical moment we talk about where you lurch.
Yeah, so,
right?
I mean.
So then the question is, all right, so let's forget all the Alexander explanations and just look at that data and try and come up with some models that work. And one of the paradoxes is that in most activities, when you slow down the activity, it gets easier to do. So if you are playing the piano and you're learning a new piece, then of course you slow it down and you can figure out where the fingers go. But with this movement, it didn't matter that you slow it down, and you know this from lessons. It doesn't matter. In fact, sometimes it gets harder the more you slow it down to avoid that lurch.
Interesting.
So what the heck is going on there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, actually, because of course it is true that when we're practicing the piano and we're learning a new piece, we slow the music down. But funnily enough, sometimes when you play it at a faster speed, you do find it easier.
Okay. But you know what I mean, right?
But that is just a very simple thing. It's definitely true that you slow it down.
From a very simple perspective, when you slow movement down, you can say, okay, now it's this finger, now it's this finger. So why can't people just slow the movement down and get through that sticky part? So it's a bit of a paradox.
Yes.
And there's a few possibilities. One of the descriptions you see in some Alexander books is that people sort of just can't inhibit enough. They don't have a certain ability to calm themselves down, to inhibit that lurch. And I guess there's some truth to that, but it's hard to put that into a scientific context.
Sure.
And so Tim basically went through a couple of different explanations, and I won't go into too much detail, but it comes down to two qualities: the ability to keep your hip joints free, so keep your hip joints from stiffening in a movement or in a position. And because if you can't, then you get stuck and you got to throw yourself over that point.
Yeah.
And the other is this ability to, as you tip forward, match the force of gravity. So gravity is trying to squeeze you down. Can you do that again without stiffening? And so both of those fit into kind of a posture context.
Yes, and that's very interesting, isn't it? Because in fact, the fact that when you learn how to do that, it does give you some sense of control gravity, which you didn't have before, which is quite self-empowering. It's definitely an Alexander experience, that, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Yeah. So well, that's very interesting then. So yeah, so you're looking at stuff like that. What else we wanted to talk about today was, of course, we had this a very brief conversation on Facebook, in the Facebook groups, about the nature of the language we use to describe Alexander technique. And of course, I'm
Right.
a wordsmith. I like, as you've seen a few of my blogs, I like writing, and I used to be an actor. So lots and lots of different types of writing, and I'm interested in literature as well.
Right.
Alexander, of course, was an actor, and I'm sure he enjoyed reading, although he never became quite the great writer, we might say. but obviously, Alexander technique and words are quite synonymous. They live together. So, of course, the language we use to describe it, and as teachers, of course, we've got to use language to describe ideas. We need to simplify the language rather than complicate it, because some of the ideas are quite challenging for the people that we teach. So let's talk about that. I mean, we have this word, for example, inhibition, and a lot of people, because of Freud's interpretation of inhibition, have a problem with that. They were really born around very much the same time, oddly. And they both used inhibition as a key word in their framework. Of course, we know inhibition in Alexander technique is a much more simple approach, and it's much more a reflection of what the word really means, or at least the initial meaning of the word, just to stop. What are your thoughts on using that word, for example? I mean, are you happy with that?
Right. So this is where I feel like I've made more of a contribution to the workshops. And it came out of the fact that when we started working with teachers, they would ask us, okay, can you explain inhibition scientifically? Yeah. And we would get an idea of what they meant by inhibition, and we would talk about it. And then they would either be satisfied or dissatisfied. And sometimes they were dissatisfied because their idea of what inhibition was different from what our idea was. Ooh. And we started to look at this more carefully and really try to interview teachers throughout the workshops. So now we've done this for literally like 500, 600, 700 teachers. Wow. And we find a spectrum of interpretations. And it doesn't mean that teachers necessarily disagree about the meanings, although in certain cases they do. But what it means is that at any given time, teachers might be using the word to refer to different experiences. Yeah. And clearly they'll have different personal teaching methods of putting the idea across. Well, that's right. And so that's another question. And so I spent quite a bit of time with the topic of inhibition and formulated a kind of categorization of the different ways that teachers use it. Wow. And then John Nichols actually joined one of our workshops, and I talked to him about it. And it turns out he had already made a categorization that was quite similar to what I had come up with. Wow, he's a bit of a genius, isn't he, John Nichols? He's very good with clarifying in words. And and so what we did, or myself and Tim and John and Rajal Cohen helped out. She's a very important researcher for Alexander technique at the University of Idaho, was to try to match scientific ideas to the different categories of the way that teachers use the word inhibition. And so the three different categories we worked with were the one that you described, number one, which is stopping. Yeah. So it's basically there's a stimulus and you stop everything. Yeah. And people describe that in various ways. The second way people use the word is like someone gets up out of the chair and they notice that their neck tightens when they do that. Yeah. And so they say, or the teacher says, or they say, that's a pattern that I need to inhibit. Yeah. That's extra stuff on top of something underneath that's very good. And so I want to inhibit that pattern. That's from a scientist's perspective, that's different than
Yeah.
just a kind of full stop, right?
It's less
And
general,
so,
more specific.
right,
Yeah.
right. So then the third way would be more of a state of being, shall we say, a certain calm,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So like his inhibition was apparent. He was calm. He had a sense of space around him.
Yes.
His
Yeah.
breathing was
Right. Yeah.
full. He was ready to move in any direction. I don't know, all sorts of different ways that people
Is that
describe
not akin
this
to?
more of a state.
Yeah, I think that state, is that not what I think we used to call it, being directed?
Well, okay, so so there you go.
Yeah.
So people, okay, so you can sort of, you can interview teachers.
Yeah.
And you can, without putting words into their mouth, try and get them to describe these different phenomena, states or actions or practices or skills or tasks or whatever. And you come up with a different phenomena and people talking about them in different ways. So what you call well-directed, somebody else might call sort of a state of
being inhibited.
Yeah, being inhibited sounds negative, but other people say, things like, his inhibition was, he had such a force of inhibition or something like that. I don't know.
No, I've heard this.
I feel like I've heard Carrington described as sort of like, in a kind of Buddha kind of like Zen. Well, connected that with a kind of persistent inhibition, if you will.
That's why it's so interesting, because of course, what we're dealing with in Alexander technique ultimately is phenomena. It's experience of ourselves, it's progressive experience of ourselves, it's many different things, and narrowing that down into a sort of perfect vernacular is obviously going to be very difficult. But I find the subject fascinating. I mean, my experience of it, and you might have seen this on my blog, it was there, I think it's written up, but there was a story that I heard when I was training, because obviously I trained, with water, and there was a story where one day the students were really annoyed, particularly at this direction, head forward and up. And they were kind of, and it's a wonderful image, because you just imagine, I've had this marvelous experience developing this amazing technique, darling, and I'm going to give it to the world, And so the first time you do that, you got this bunch of guys, turn up, and halfway through the course, they're telling you, you're all wrong, it's not working, So FM was like, I imagine myself being in that sort of position, because you've had great success, you've taught Aldous Huxley, you've taught, all these wonderful famous people, John Dewey, of course, and now the students are rebelling. It was a really interesting story. And of course, so he what he does in true FM fashion is he gets in touch with John Dewey, who's an educationalist, very huge, very famous philosopher. I mean, they sort of talk about him being the leading philosopher of the 20th century in America. He's an amazing guy. I mean, you know him, of course. He comes over and they spend 6 months breaking down the language of the Alexander technique. Every single thing, yes, let's throw out, head forward and up. Let's think of a different idea, do all this stuff. And then it comes to the day when they're going to announce to the students what they've discovered, John Dewey and Alexander, So he goes into the classroom, and he says to the guys, look, I'm going to let John talk to you because, I think he can do this best. And he stands up, John Dewey, and he says, I've looked at every single word FM has developed. And he says, I'm not going to change a single thing.
I had heard something like that. I never heard that story.
Okay. So obviously not all of us agree with that.
Can I say something about that?
Hey, please do, yeah.
Because I love the story, and I don't know enough of the details about all of those events to say what was going on or to put judgment on it or something. But
sure.
Let me just describe what we do and why I think it's really exciting, which is we basically have the students, I call them students, these are all teachers, so I say participants, shall we say. We basically have them.
You mean trained Alexander teacher students?
Yeah. We basically have them go off on their own and think about their experiences of the various phenomena, like head forward and up.
Yeah.
And to describe those without using the common jargon. Not because the common jargon is wrong, but because as soon as you use common jargon, then everybody is kind of latched on to the same words. And so there's no possibility of subtlety or novelty. So we have them go off and do that, and then we have them compare their own descriptions of those phenomena with each other. And what's really exciting is that, I mean, my fear was sort of like the trainees in the training program, like suddenly I would just figure out that I didn't know what head forward and up really was, and someone was going to describe something completely different. But what's exciting is that you get lots of overlap. So people will describe their experience in a unique way that you might probably haven't heard before. Yeah. But you're like, yeah, I know that. That's it. And then you feel so much. I just get a great sense of connection from that. And I think it. Again, I don't know enough about the history to place any judgment, but I can imagine that this sort of I don't know, a kind of philosopher's approach or a master's approach, where the master is going to go off and figure out the perfect way to say it, and then that's enough. I mean, it's a little like my roommate in college who was a philosophy major, and he wrote a paper, and he asked me to read it and help him with editing it before he turned it in, and he gave it to me, and I looked at it and I was like, I have no idea.
Good luck.
I had no idea. And he was like, well, you just don't know how to read my words.
No.
Right? So he put the blame on me, he went off and submitted the paper. I don't know, probably. Who knows?
That's crazy, because I mean, like I say, I had a friend who was a PhD, and she was doing biology. I said, oh, I'm interested in biology. I like that. Oh, you must show me your dissertation at the end, when you've finally published it. She said, I don't think you're going to really be interested, Nick. I said, oh, no, I would love to see it. She gave it to me, a nice bound copy. Have a look then, Nick. I couldn't read the first paragraph.
Right. Well, okay. So, but the difference is that one of the things that what I think is really important, both for connecting with science, but also with teachers connecting with each other and with students and marketing and all this stuff, is that, at the end of the day, Alexander technique is a very much experiential discipline.
Absolutely.
And
it's also
I think there's a rich sort of, pool of experiences that even people quite new to the technique can share that really do give insight. And I think maybe historically we're kind of biased towards, your sensory appreciation is faulty. I know what this is. You use these words, whatever. So anyway, I mean, we're going a little bit off topic, but in a sense, it's on topic in the sense that one of the exciting things about these workshops is they really forced us to get people to describe things in very concrete, personal, experiential ways. And sort of to our surprise, it turned out to be a big success in terms of just improving the communication. I mean, I can show you sometime, these 2-3 paragraph long descriptions of releasing one shoulder with directing, and it's
workshopping stuff is what we do.
It's great, So
I mean, one of the things that interests me is the fact that there are many people, teachers, mainly experienced of 20 and 30 years, who do tend to move away from the basic concepts. And particularly they move away from ideas about neck free, well, even some young pupils as well, actually, I have met, and they move away from things like neck free, head forward and up, back to lengthen and widen, knees going forward. and they say, oh, I don't use directions anymore, and or I'm not doing Alexander. I mean, one guy, I don't even really do the Alexander technique anymore, But what interests me about that is the fact that, I went along to an Alexander teacher and I had no clue about my body. I had lower back pain. I was very I had all the kind of same sort of problems everyone has when they come to Alexander teacher. And of course, as I learned the technique in that very specific way, learning about inhibition, learning about direction, I found my salvation. I found that liberty. So I think that I probably teach in a very puritanical way, or in a very pure way, simply because I want to give someone that experience, and I daren't kind of throw in any of my own creativity or imagination, because I think, well, what if I do that and it doesn't work as well as what I originally taught? So what do you say about that sort of, because I've been chewing that over for a while, that kind of idea. What would you say about that?
It's a big question. I mean, I can tell you my own personal experience as a teacher,
yeah,
and a practitioner, which is that my experience was sort of coming out of training. There was a lot of stuff that I didn't understand in the way I wanted to as a scientist.
When you actually graduate.
Right. Yeah, right. And a lot of teachers talk about it. It's something I would love to hear more about.
Same here.
Right.
Yeah, I always talk about the first 3 to 5 years. Sorry, what did I know? What did I say?
Exactly. Right. Interesting phenomenon, right?
Wow.
So there's some period of reconstructing things and experimenting, if you will, but not necessarily. I mean, I don't know, just listening and practicing as best you can and noticing what's going on. Mm. And what's exciting for me at the moment, so I'm about 11 years out of the training program. Yeah, what's exciting to me is that a lot of the experiences, a lot of the words even that were given to me in the training, come back. Yeah. When you sort of, well, for me, kind of rediscovering these phenomena. Yeah. Going, oh yeah, head forward, and the neck spring head's going forward and up, the back's lengthening, widening, and I'm breathing different than these are, it's like, so I think what's really interesting, and it would be, it's something it would be good to talk to a lot of teachers in a very open way about if they're experimenting is, are there fundamental experiences that are shared that have to do with an experience that I often have and I often teach, which is this thing that starts up here with the neck and the head, and there's a balancing, and the spine comes up underneath, and the breathing starts, and then the legs and the limbs release, and the shoulders widen, and you're like, whoa, that's a thing. And I could call that neck head forward and up, back length widens, or I could call that something else, the neck giving permission for the head to balance, blah, blah, blah. But it's the same thing. I'm just using different words to describe it. Yeah. And so to me, the interesting question is not which words are you using. The interesting question is, are we experiencing the same phenomenon?
Is my pupil experiencing?
And when is my students experiencing? And is it like a kind of fuzzy, a collection of phenomena with a fuzzy boundary? Is it one specific thing? Is it just a totally diverse set of phenomena that everyone's taking a little piece of? Like, that's really interesting. And I can only say my experience.
Yeah, I think the first 20 years are fairly fuzzy though, aren't they?
With that, yeah, right. I think McDonald's said that the first 50 years were hard or something like that.
Yeah, so. Right, okay. Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, but that's the interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, because we are definitely in love with the experiences that we've had, and when we're in love, we want everyone to feel that, right? And that's why we become teachers, and of course that's what we're trying to do. And the question is always, how best are we going to do that? And so, do we teach inhibition and direction? And some people think that we shouldn't, or some people think that we need to change the words. And some people really talk a lot about inhibition, but they don't really talk about direction. And I think that's really interesting because clearly, you know, that is the thing, isn't it, about a technique like this? It can be pulled apart and you can use bits of it. I mean, when I was a drama student, they used sort of micro bits of it. And it wasn't until years later that I thought, oh, I see, they were doing a kind of version of the Alexander technique. So effectively, I didn't start Alexander technique when I was 24. I probably started when I was 18, but it wasn't really the same kind of thing, you know. And that's also something that I think prevents the Alexander technique going forward, that vagary around what it is we do and what bits they've taken out and who's doing it in what way, you know. In a way, you know, if you buy a Porsche car, you're not really buying a bit of a Mini and a bit of a Land Rover. And, you know, nobody wants that. You know, there's a hybrid. In fact, hybrid cars, you know, can be annoying too, can't they? You know.
Yeah. Look, I mean, my let's say I have personal experiences, I have personal opinions. They're fairly strong.
Yeah.
But my job in this kind of format and when I'm doing workshops is basically to largely keep my personal experiences on the
back burner,
tuned down, on the back burner, shall we say, because because I want to know what's going on, and I want to know what's going on with other teachers and other students. And I want to keep as open a mind as I can. I think that's good. And you know, it's a very interesting subject. I mean, you hear so many stories about expert teachers teaching for 40, 50 years. And they'll say about another expert teacher is teaching 40, 50 years. Well, what they're doing is not the same as what we're doing. So what do you say to that? You can say, well, this is really it, and that's not it, or that's really it, and that's not it. Or you can say, well, what are you doing? You know, can you describe that without, you know, just say taking possession of the word inhibition or direction? Absolutely. And without saying, well, this is what Alexander did exactly. I mean, that's fine. I have no problem with those debates. But they usually end up kind of boring in a way. I'm much more interested in finding out what's going on. And so I guess, you know, to come full circle, that's where I feel like my science background forms, that's been formative. What's the word? I mean, that has influenced the way that I approach these things. I want to know what's going on with you. I want to know what's going on with me. And I want to see where the overlap is.
I mean, in that sense, it's a very people-oriented experience being an Alexander teacher. And of course, we want to keep things very open. I mean, I just wanted to talk a little bit more scientifically again now about the primary control. You know, the primary control is obviously something that we can definitely get our heads around scientifically, particularly from a physiological perspective, because, you know, there are going to be a certain amount of physiologists who refuse to accept that there is even a primary control. Now, the primary control is something that we talk a lot about in Alexander technique, and we do obviously teach our pupils. We also can really get some major, just profound experiences by just exploring really in depth the experience of the primary control. What do you think about that?
So this is the kind of question I used to answer directly, and I don't answer anymore. And the reason I don't answer it is I can't move forward without you describing for me an experience of what you're talking about in action, because I don't know. Like, I have my own ideas about why are the words primary control. And I associate with those with a collection of experiences. But I promise you, I've been giving workshops all over the world now for 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
And I've heard every description of what primary control is from very experienced teachers.
Yeah.
And the overlap is pretty fuzzy.
Yeah.
So we could try to move forward with this if you would give me an experience. But I can't. I'll get into big trouble if I try to say what the primary control is.
No, I mean, I think the question is really, is there a primary control? Do you think there is a primary control? I mean, and is that a sort of major concept that we want to take forward? But I think this keeps coming up, doesn't it? This word fuzzy. And I think it's really helpful for us to understand why that is. And of course, the reason is because I suppose really in a way, we have the 4 books of FM, but they are very fuzzy in that the language is relatively opaque. It's difficult to penetrate. It's actually difficult to even concentrate because of the way it's written. And that means that we don't have like a scientific textbook about it. We then go into what is effectively a very oral tradition and experiential tradition in the training process. And that means that when we come out the other side, we're then teaching our technique. We've got our own pupils, we run our own businesses. And so things become very much the way we decide they should be. And the fuzziness, really, in a way, is because there isn't really a textbook answer to the question of what works and what doesn't, and how should this work now, how should that work. Now, that isn't to say that the technique is not, brilliant, and all these people are having these wonderful experiences and fixing their back pain and improving their confidence and I don't know what, all the things that we love about the technique. But it does say that there might be a problem going forward. And that was my next question, is because obviously I was very impressed with what you were saying about, and what you've been saying today, about this whole, I mean, I'm sure there are 100 Alexander teachers who are going to watch this and they're going to just think, oh God, Patrick, you're amazing. I want to be like that. I want to go and do this research. I mean, to have 700 or 800 Alexander teachers and to have asked them these questions is, for an Alexander teacher, if you think about it, just deeply profound. And it's one of the reasons why I like doing these interviews, because I get to talk to you and to different teachers, and that's a wonderful thing in itself, But to finish off now, because we are coming to the end of our time, I just want to ask you, how do you see us taking the Alexander technique forward with the science, with the language that we're using? How do we get rid of that fuzziness, and how do we become, how do we establish ourselves going into the future where things are very technological? Apps work or they don't work. Nobody wants one that halfway works. How are we going to take that forward? What are we going to do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no more qualified than anyone else to answer this very mysterious question. I mean, I was just reading about it on Facebook today, the debates about why aren't we more well-known? We're so great. Why aren't we? Okay. Yeah. I don't know. So the first answer is I don't know. Yeah. From a science side, I would say that my first recommendation is just don't say stuff that's wrong.
Right.
It's like do no wrong, right? That's the what is it? The doctor's.
Yeah, give me an example of what you're talking about there. That's interesting.
First, do no wrong. So if you don't know why something's happening, if you don't know why your student, goes up when you think about your own back expanding, then live with that. Or ask someone like Tim, who's done decades of research, or Rajal Cohen, who's done literally decades of research on this. If you want to explain things to the world on your website or to the doctor, your physical therapist, whatever, don't go back and say, well, we activated the Magnus reflex and da 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 da. That's outdated. Don't make up some model of tensegrity. It's great for pedagogical purposes, but it's meh. So try not to say things that are wrong.
Sure.
And that's not a problem. There are plenty of disciplines that are, Tai Chi is very popular. Yeah. Without having any, science necessarily. People don't a Tai Chi master doesn't have to describe the science to get students. He just,
they get the experience and they love it and they stay.
Yeah, they're like, this feels great. I love this,
Yeah.
and it's very profound.
Yeah.
And he or she might even use language that makes no sense whatsoever. But don't try and get into the science without doing your homework. And doing your homework means like really talking to people who have been in that game for a long time.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, what you're saying there is keep it simple. Because
keep it simple, and don't be afraid to describe what you know, and what you experience and your students experience. I mean, there is no science out there that explains the cause of back pain. It's just not there.
Exactly.
Right. So it's fine that we are working with these, ideas, traditions, intuitions, whatever, these things that we have been developing as a group since Alexander first started working in this way.
Yeah.
That's fine, because nobody has a perfect scientific model for how the body works, why we have pain, why we stiffen up,
exactly.
Why we overfocus, all this stuff. So, that's fine.
Yeah.
What else? I don't know. I don't have a huge problem with, I don't make a big deal about getting super specific about what it is that we're doing.
Sure.
Just because I have experience with, my wife is a Pilates teacher. There's all sorts of different styles of Pilates.
Yeah.
And people disagree about all sorts of stuff, and it's like a multi-billion-dollar industry. So I don't think a bit of conflict and diverse approaches is the worst thing in the world. I mean,
no, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, but also, I mean, I think you'll understand this, being, as I say, an academic and a PhD, clarity is king. We do need to be clear. And the fuzziness that's come up even today in our conversation is something that we do need to address. We do need people, the lay people, to be walking around saying, yeah, I did Alexander technique, I had a bad back, it was great, or, something easy, not that they were like, because, when you do marketing, you the first thing you say is, well, okay, how do I describe it? And you say, well, how do you describe the color red? It's very difficult, right? Because it's experiential. You experience the color red. Alexander technique is a little bit like that, but not quite. We can explain it simply and effectively. But as you say, there are 100 different versions of how you do that, or maybe 2,000.
Yeah. I mean, so to go the other way, the other side of my own experience is that Tim and I and Rajal and Andrew McCann has been, there's a number of people who have been working together to come up with a framework.
Yeah, right.
Especially Tim's research, but building on that, we do feel like we have a framework.
Yeah.
That is rigorously connected to current ideas in science, that gives you a way to talk about what you do, even if it doesn't give you an exact explanation for what is the primary control and how does it work.
Yeah.
It gives you enough tools, enough language, enough concepts to be perfectly clear about what's going on. Oh, you just had a shift in postural tone. That's going to affect not only the way you move, but also the way you think about your body and the way you react to emotional situations.
Yeah, I like that.
And that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the solution though, because I don't know. It is very complicated how these things work. You could market the Alexander technique and say, we don't know what the heck's going on, but it feels great. Come on in, right? And maybe that will work.
Sure. I don't know how that
who knows?
Work. I might try it, But
try it. If it works, fine.
I mean, if it keeps making you happy, then you should really do it. That is it.
Do it. If you don't need to. Yeah, actually, Rajal Cohen was showing me something about. There's some research thing about what kind of back pain remedies do students stick to, And it was basically the ones that felt the best.
Yeah, quite. Yeah.
They felt good, they did it, and if they did it, they felt better in their back.
Yeah, I always say to people, if you
I
can
don't
put it
know.
in your pocket and take it with you, it's going to work.
Yeah,
Because one of the good things about the Alexander technique is that you can put it in your pocket. You can take it with you. You don't have to strap yourself up or pop loads of pills or, do weird exercises. It's a little bit more straightforward than that. And of course, that is obviously why it's high functioning.
yeah.
But
There's some interesting surveys that go along with the the neck pain study and the back pain study.
yeah,
These big studies. They also, in parallel to the measurements of pain, they also did interviews and some more qualitative
yeah,
data collection on what did people take with them. And this idea of self-efficacy was a very strong effect.
yes,
The idea that people felt like they had tools that they could use when they were in pain.
Yeah, that's a big thing for me. Yeah, definitely.
So,
well, final question: when is the book coming out?
I don't know, but we got
It better be coming out. Come on, we want this book, right?
Look, go to our website. Okay, I'll make a pitch. Go to our website, alexandertechniquescience.com. There's a bunch of articles there.
Yeah.
Take our course. It's 7 weeks. It's fantastic. We've been doing it for 6 years now, and it's amazing.
Yeah. And who's the course for? Who's the course for?
The course is for teachers, mainly for teachers and enthusiastic students. It's basically anyone with experience with Alexander technique who wants to know what's going on.
But again, definitely past the 30 lesson mark.
Yeah, I would say, sure. Past the 30 lesson mark. Honestly, it's mostly teachers, but we do get enthusiastic students.
Yeah, great.
What else? Just, keep looking into it.
And the important thing is that the course can be done on Zoom.
It's a Zoom course. That's what it is.
Zoom course, so we don't have to fly over to.
We're translating now to Japanese for Japanese teachers.
Ooh.
We're busy translating to German.
Nice.
We've got some stuff in French.
Dutch.
The Dutch speak such good English that there hasn't been much of a demand for that. But
okay.
We're just getting into that.
Okay.
Will there come a book out eventually? Yes, I suppose.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, it sounds good, and it sounds interesting, and I think there is a book there for sure.
Oh yeah.
So, well, look, so thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been really enlightening, and I think the work you're doing is great.
Thank you.
And I hope that you carry on, and perhaps when the book is coming out, we'll have another one of these little chats on Zoom, and we'll get that content up there.
Sure. Thanks a lot. It was fun.